On the morning of April 23, 1945, a convoy of 12 olive-drab trucks rumbled through the Bavarian countryside, carrying 347 German women who had served as military auxiliaries, communications operators, and administrative personnel for the German armed forces during the war. The women sat in silence on wooden benches, their grey-green uniforms dusty and wrinkled after 3 days of processing through temporary holding facilities. Most of them were between 19 and 28 years old, and nearly all of them believed they were being transported to forced labor camps in Siberia, or worse, to face tribunals that would end with their execution. They had heard the stories, passed in whispers through the chaos of the collapsing front, about what happened to those captured by the advancing armies. They could not have been more wrong about what awaited them. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these women were about to experience over the following weeks would fundamentally transform their understanding of their former enemy, challenge everything they had been taught about American culture and values, and leave impressions so profound that many of them would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality. This is the story of how simple acts of unexpected kindness, symbolized by foods as ordinary as hamburgers and Coca-Cola, became instruments of psychological transformation more powerful than any weapon. Hildegard Brenner was 23 years old and had served for 2 years as a communications auxiliary in a signals battalion near Munich. She sat near the back of the third truck, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the spring countryside pass through gaps in the canvas covering. The apple trees were blooming, she noticed, their white and pink blossoms incongruously cheerful against the grey mood inside the vehicle. Beside her sat her friend Margaret Hoffman, 25, who had worked as a clerk processing supply requisitions. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing to say that would not make the fear worse. Hildegard had joined the auxiliary services in 1943, partly out of genuine belief in her country's cause, and partly because the alternative was factory work that paid less and offered no status. She had been good at her job, efficiently routing messages and maintaining equipment, and she had taken pride in her contribution to the war effort. Now that pride felt like a weight around her neck, evidence that would surely be used against her. She had heard that the Americans kept detailed records, that they knew everything about everyone, that their intelligence services had files on every German who had served in any capacity. What Hildegard did not know was that the convoy was heading toward Camp 17, a newly established facility near the town of Friedberg that had been specifically designed for processing female auxiliaries. The camp was under the command of Major Catherine Reynolds, a 41-year-old officer from Portland, Oregon, who had spent the previous 18 months developing protocols for handling captured female personnel with an approach that differed dramatically from standard practices. Major Reynolds believed that the women who had served the German military were, in most cases, more victims of circumstance than committed ideologues, and she had designed her facility around principles of psychological rehabilitation through humane treatment. The trucks arrived at Camp 17 shortly after noon. Hildegard felt her stomach clench as the vehicle slowed and stopped. Through the canvas, she could see a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, guard towers at the corners, rows of long wooden buildings. It looked exactly like what she had imagined a prison camp would look like. She heard American voices shouting orders in English, a language she understood only partially from her school years. Someone was telling them to line up. Someone else was saying something about processing. The word processing made her think of meat being prepared for consumption. The women climbed down from the trucks on unsteady legs. They were organized into lines of 20, then marched toward a large building at the center of the compound. Hildegard noticed that the American guards, both men and women, were not pointing weapons at them. Their rifles were slung over their shoulders. Some of them were even smiling slightly, though not in a way that seemed threatening. One young American woman with red hair said something to her companion that made them both laugh, and Hildegard felt a flash of resentment. How could they laugh when she and her compatriots were facing such uncertainty? Inside the processing building, the women were directed to tables where American personnel took their names, ranks, service numbers, and unit assignments. Hildegard answered the questions mechanically, her voice barely above a whisper. The American woman interviewing her spoke German with a heavy accent, but was surprisingly fluent. She asked Hildegard if she had any injuries or medical conditions, if she needed any medications, if she had any dietary restrictions. The questions seemed absurd given the circumstances. Who cared about dietary restrictions when you were a prisoner? After the interviews came the medical examinations. Hildegard had expected something humiliating, perhaps even painful, but the American doctors and nurses were brisk and professional. They checked her temperature, her blood pressure, her heart rate. They looked in her ears and throat. They asked if she had any concerns about her health. A nurse gave her a small bar of soap and a clean towel and directed her to the showers. The water was warm. The soap smelled like lavender. Hildegard stood under the spray for longer than necessary, letting the water wash away 3 days of grime and fear, trying to reconcile this treatment with everything she had expected. When she emerged from the showers, wrapped in the towel, she found that her old uniform had been taken away. In its place was a set of clean clothes, not a prison uniform, but simple civilian attire, a white blouse and a grey skirt, undergarments, socks, and a pair of sturdy shoes. Everything was used but clean and in good repair. A tag pinned to the blouse indicated it had been donated by the American Red Cross. Hildegard dressed slowly, running her fingers over the cotton fabric, trying to understand what was happening. The women were then led to their barracks, long buildings divided into dormitory-style rooms with bunk beds, footlockers, and windows that let in the afternoon sunlight. Each woman was assigned a bed with clean sheets, a pillow, and 2 wool blankets. There were no locks on the doors. A schedule posted on the wall indicated meal times, work assignments, recreation periods, and educational classes. Educational classes. Hildegard read the words 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding. Why would their captors educate them? Major Catherine Reynolds made her first appearance that evening, walking through each barracks to introduce herself and explain the camp's purpose. She was a tall woman with greying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she spoke German with careful precision, occasionally consulting a small notebook for vocabulary she had not yet mastered. She told the women that they were being held pending final determination of their status under international protocols governing captured military personnel. She told them that they would be treated humanely in accordance with American values and the principles of civilized conduct. She told them that their cooperation was expected, but that they would not be mistreated if they followed the rules. Then she told them something that made Hildegard think she had misheard. Dinner would be served in 30 minutes in the mess hall. They would be eating the same food that American service members ate. If anyone had questions or concerns, they should speak to their barrack supervisor, a German-speaking American sergeant named Patricia Walsh. The same food that American service members ate. Hildegard exchanged glances with Margarete, seeing her own confusion mirrored in her friend's face. It had to be a trick of some kind. It had to be. 30 minutes later, the women filed into the mess hall, a large building with wooden tables and benches that could seat perhaps 200 people. The smell hit Hildegard before she could see the food, a rich, savory aroma that made her mouth water involuntarily. She had been surviving on thin soup and hard bread for weeks as the German supply system collapsed around her. She had forgotten what real food smelled like. The women lined up at a serving counter where American cooks, both men and women, stood ready with ladles and spatulas. Hildegard watched the woman ahead of her receive a tray with compartments like nothing she had seen before. Into one compartment went a thick patty of ground meat between 2 halves of a round bread roll, what she would later learn was called a hamburger. Into another went a pile of thin, crispy golden strips that she recognized as fried potatoes, but prepared in a way she had never seen. Into a third went a serving of green beans cooked with bits of something that smelled like smoked meat. And then came the drinks. The cook asked her something in English, gesturing to 2 large containers. Another woman translated, "Coffee or Coca-Cola?" Hildegard had heard of Coca-Cola, of course. Everyone had heard of Coca-Cola. It was the symbol of American decadence, the frivolous luxury that proved how soft and undisciplined the Americans were. She had never tasted it. She had never even seen a bottle of it in person. "Coffee," she said automatically, then immediately regretted it. Margarete, behind her in line, chose the Coca-Cola, and Hildegard wished she had been braver. The women carried their trays to the tables and sat down. For a long moment, nobody ate. They looked at the food, then at each other, then at the American personnel who were eating at their own tables across the room, consuming the same meal without apparent concern. Finally, someone took a bite. Then another woman. Then the eating began in earnest. Hildegard picked up the hamburger with both hands, uncertain of the proper way to consume it. She took a bite. The meat was juicy and well seasoned, the bread soft and fresh, and there was a tangy sauce and crisp vegetables inside that created a combination of flavors unlike anything she had experienced. She took another bite, then another, eating faster than she meant to, unable to stop herself. Beside her, Margarete was drinking her Coca-Cola, her eyes wide with surprise. "How is it?" Hildegard asked. Margarete shook her head slowly. "It is sweet, very sweet, and there are bubbles. It tingles on my tongue. I do not know if I like it or not, but I cannot stop drinking it." Hildegard reached over and took a sip from Margarete's glass. The sensation was extraordinary, the sweetness and the carbonation and the unfamiliar flavor, creating something that felt almost aggressive in its pleasantness. She understood immediately why this drink had become symbolic of America. It was excessive. It was unnecessary. It was, she had to admit, delicious. Around them, other women were having similar reactions. Some ate in silence, focused entirely on their food. Others whispered to each other, trying to process what was happening. A woman at the next table began to cry, and Hildegard understood. The food was not just nourishment, it was a message. It was proof that everything they had been told about their captors was wrong. That first meal at Camp 17 lasted over an hour. The American cooks brought out more hamburgers, more fried potatoes, more Coca-Cola. They seemed pleased that the women were eating with such enthusiasm. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, walked among the tables asking through a translator if everyone had enough, if anyone wanted seconds, if the food was acceptable. Acceptable. Hildegard almost laughed at the word. She had not eaten this well since before the war. After dinner, the women returned to their barracks in a state of collective bewilderment. Hildegard lay on her bunk, her stomach full for the first time in months, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening. The Americans had no reason to feed them well. The war was over. Germany had lost. The women in this camp had served the enemy. By every logic Hildegard understood, they should be punished, not pampered. Yet here she was, clean, clothed, fed, lying in a comfortable bed with no guard standing over her with a weapon. It made no sense. Margarete climbed up to sit on the edge of Hildegard's bunk. "I think it is psychological warfare," she whispered. "They want to confuse us. They want us to trust them, so we will tell them things." "Tell them what things?" Hildegard whispered back. "We were communications auxiliaries and clerks. We do not know any secrets worth knowing." Margarete had no answer to that. Over the following days, the women of Camp 17 began to settle into a routine that further challenged their expectations. They woke at 6 in the morning to a bell, not a harsh alarm, but a gentle chiming that seemed designed to ease them into consciousness. They washed and dressed and went to breakfast, where they were served eggs, toast with butter and jam, oatmeal, fruit, and more coffee or Coca-Cola. They reported for work assignments that turned out to be surprisingly light, mostly cleaning and maintenance of the camp facilities, tasks that occupied them for only a few hours each day. In the afternoons, they attended the educational classes that Hildegard had found so confusing. The classes were taught by American officers and civilian instructors who spoke German with varying degrees of fluency. The subjects were democracy, American history, the causes and consequences of the war, and something called civic responsibility. At first, the women sat through these sessions with barely concealed skepticism, assuming they were being subjected to propaganda designed to turn them against their own country. But the instructors did not demand agreement. They did not punish women who asked challenging questions or expressed doubts. They presented information and encouraged discussion, and slowly, reluctantly, the women began to engage. Hildegard found herself particularly drawn to a class taught by Lieutenant James Whitmore, a 29-year-old former high school teacher from Illinois who had joined the army in 1942. Lieutenant Whitmore spoke German fluently, having studied it at university, and he taught a class on American government that Hildegard had initially dismissed as irrelevant to her life. But Whitmore had a gift for making abstract concepts concrete, and he connected the principles he was teaching to the lived experiences of his students in ways that made them actually think. He talked about the separation of powers, about how the American system was designed to prevent any one person or group from gaining too much control. He talked about the freedom of the press, about how newspapers in America could criticize the government without their editors being thrown in prison. He talked about the right to vote, about how American citizens chose their leaders in elections that happened on schedule, regardless of whether the current leaders wanted to give up power. And then he asked the women questions. What would have happened if someone in Germany had written newspaper articles criticizing the government during the war? What would have happened if citizens had been able to vote on whether to continue the conflict? These questions made Hildegard uncomfortable, not because she did not know the answers, but because she did. She had known people who had been arrested for saying the wrong things. She had heard about newspapers being shut down and editors disappearing. She had understood, even while it was happening, that there was no mechanism for ordinary citizens to change the direction their country was taking. At the time, she had accepted this as necessary for national unity. Now, sitting in a clean classroom with a full stomach, being asked to consider alternatives, she felt something shifting inside her. But it was not only the classes that changed the women. It was the accumulation of small experiences that contradicted everything they thought they knew about Americans. It was the camp library, a small building stocked with books in German and English, where the women could read whatever they wanted without anyone checking or approving their choices. Hildegard found novels she had not been able to access during the war, books that had been banned or simply unavailable, and she read them in the evenings with a hunger that surprised her. It was the recreation yard where the Americans had set up a volleyball net and provided equipment for other games, and where they actually played alongside the German women sometimes, laughing and joking and treating them like human beings rather than enemies. It was the infirmary, where a woman named Inge Becker was diagnosed with appendicitis and operated on by American surgeons who saved her life and then visited her every day during her recovery, bringing her flowers from outside the camp because they thought they might cheer her up. It was the mail system, established 3 weeks into their captivity, through which the women could write letters to their families and receive responses, a connection to their loved ones that many of them had assumed would be severed forever. And it was the food, always, constantly, it was the food. The meals at Camp 17 became a daily ritual of astonishment. Breakfast brought not just eggs and toast, but pancakes with maple syrup, bacon, sausages, hash browns, fresh fruit, and pastries that the cooks called danishes and donuts. Lunch brought sandwiches thick with meat and cheese, soups rich with vegetables and cream, salads with dressings Hildegard had never imagined. Dinner brought roast chicken, pork chops, beef stew, meatloaf, fish fillets, all accompanied by multiple vegetables and potatoes, prepared in various ways, and bread that was always fresh and plentiful. And always there was Coca-Cola, the strange sweet drink that the women had initially regarded with suspicion and now consumed with enthusiasm. Hildegard tried her first Coca-Cola a week after arriving at the camp. She had been holding back, telling herself it was a matter of principle that she would not succumb to the seduction of American consumer culture. But the weather was warm, and the drink looked refreshing, and everyone else seemed to enjoy it so much. And finally, she gave in. She took a bottle from the ice-filled container in the mess hall, popped off the cap with the provided opener, and took a long drink. The sensation was even more intense than she remembered from that first stolen sip. The sweetness flooded her mouth, the carbonation prickled her tongue and throat, and the unfamiliar flavor, some combination of vanilla and citrus and spices she could not identify, spread through her with an almost physical impact. She drank half the bottle without stopping, then stood there staring at it, trying to understand why this simple beverage affected her so strongly. It was not just the taste, she realized. It was what the taste represented. This drink was not necessary for survival. It served no practical purpose. It existed purely for pleasure, for enjoyment, for the small happiness of a cold sweet drink on a warm day. And the Americans had so much of it that they gave it freely to their prisoners. They had so much of everything that they could afford to be generous to people who had been their enemies. The abundance was almost obscene, and yet it was also undeniably appealing. Hildegard took another drink and felt something inside her, some wall of resistance begin to crumble. The women talked about the food constantly. It became their primary topic of conversation, displacing even their anxieties about the future. They compared notes on which dishes they preferred, which American foods they found strange, which ones they would want to eat again if they ever had the chance. They speculated about how the Americans produced so much food, where it all came from, how it was possible that a country fighting a war on two fronts could still feed its prisoners better than Germany had fed its own soldiers. Margaret, who had worked in supply requisitions and understood logistics, did calculations that she shared with Hildegard in whispers. Based on what they were being fed, she estimated that the Americans were providing each prisoner with over 3,000 calories per day, perhaps closer to 3,500 with the snacks that were sometimes available. This was more than double what German civilians were receiving at home, more than many German soldiers had received in the field. The implications were staggering. If they can afford to feed us like this, Margaret said, then everything we were told about them was wrong. They are not weak. They are not running out of resources. They are so strong that they can waste food on us, and it does not matter to them. Hildegard nodded, unable to argue with the logic. She had believed, because she had been told, that America was a decadent society with no discipline, that its soldiers were soft and poorly motivated, that its economy was fragile and overextended. The food on her plate 3 times a day proved all of that false. You could not feed an army and its prisoners this way unless you had an almost unimaginable surplus, unless your farms and factories and transportation systems worked with an efficiency that Germany had never achieved. The Hamburgers and Coca-Cola were not just meals. They were evidence of a productive capacity that explained more than any battle account why the war had ended as it did. This realization was painful, but it was also, in a strange way, liberating. If Germany had lost because of industrial and agricultural inferiority, rather than because of cowardice or betrayal, then the loss was not a moral judgment. It was simply mathematics. And if the loss was mathematics, then perhaps the future did not have to be defined by shame and recrimination. Perhaps it could be defined by learning, by rebuilding, by finding a way to create the kind of abundance that had defeated them. Not all the women reached this conclusion. Some remained bitter and resistant, convinced that their captivity was unjust and that the American generosity was a trick. Some withdrew into themselves, unable to reconcile their experiences with their beliefs. Some simply focused on survival, taking what was offered without analysis or interpretation. But Hildegard found that she was changing day by day, meal by meal, and she was not the only one. In the 4th week of their captivity, Major Reynolds announced that the camp would be hosting a special event, a cookout, she called it, which was apparently an American tradition involving outdoor cooking and informal socializing. The women were invited to participate not just as guests but as helpers, working alongside the American personnel to prepare and serve the food. Attendance was voluntary, Major Reynolds emphasized. No one would be punished for declining. But she hoped many of them would choose to come. Hildegard decided to volunteer. She was not entirely sure why. Part of it was curiosity about this American tradition. Part of it was a desire to do something other than sit in classes or clean barracks. And part of it, she admitted to herself, was a growing wish to understand these people who treated her so much better than she had any right to expect. The cookout was held on a Saturday afternoon in a field at the edge of the camp. American soldiers set up large grills made from oil drums cut in half, and they built fires in them using charcoal that smelled sharp and clean when it burned. Tables were arranged in rows and covered with cloths, and decorations were hung from poles, colored streamers and small flags that gave the area a festive appearance. A record player was set up on one table, playing American music that Hildegard had never heard before, but that made her want to move her body in ways she did not understand. The women who had volunteered were assigned to various tasks. Some made salads, chopping vegetables and mixing dressings under the supervision of American cooks, who demonstrated techniques and offered encouragement. Some set tables, laying out plates and utensils and glasses. Some prepared desserts, assembling ingredients for something called an apple pie and another thing called brownies that Hildegard had never encountered before. And some, including Hildegard, were assigned to help with the grilling itself. Her supervisor was a sergeant named Robert Chen, a 26-year-old from San Francisco, whose parents had immigrated from China before he was born. Sergeant Chen spoke no German, and Hildegard's English was limited, but he was patient and expressive, demonstrating what he wanted her to do with gestures and smiles that transcended language. He showed her how to form the ground beef into patties, how to season them with salt and pepper, how to place them on the grill and know when to flip them by the way the edges changed color. He showed her how to toast the buns, how to arrange the condiments, how to assemble the finished hamburgers with lettuce and tomato and onion and pickles and cheese. The work was hot and intense, standing over the smoking grill in the afternoon sun, but Hildegard found that she enjoyed it. There was something satisfying about transforming raw ingredients into finished food, about creating something that would give pleasure to others. She worked alongside Sergeant Chen for 3 hours, rarely speaking but communicating through nods and gestures and occasional laughter when something went wrong. And by the end, she felt she understood this man in some fundamental way that did not require words. When the cooking was done, the women and their American hosts sat down together to eat. There were no separate tables for prisoners and captors. Everyone mingled together, sharing plates of hamburgers and hot dogs, passing bowls of potato salad and coleslaw and baked beans, pouring cups of lemonade and, of course, Coca-Cola. The American music played on, and some of the soldiers and some of the women began to dance awkwardly at first, then with more confidence as the atmosphere relaxed. Hildegard sat at a table with Margaret, Sergeant Chen, and a young American woman named Corporal Diana Reeves, who spoke some German and served as translator. They ate and talked, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease as the food and the setting worked their magic. Corporal Reeves asked about their lives before the war, their families, their hopes for the future. Hildegard found herself answering honestly, describing her childhood in Hamburg, her father's work as a schoolteacher, her mother's death from pneumonia in 1939, her decision to join the auxiliary services because she wanted to serve her country, but also because she wanted to escape the grief and emptiness of her family home. Corporal Reeves listened with apparent interest and sympathy. She shared her own story in turn, growing up in a small town in Nebraska, coming to the army because she wanted to see the world and do something meaningful, missing her family and her dog and the open prairies of her home. For a moment, despite everything, they were just two young women talking about their lives, and the war and the captivity and the national enmities seemed very far away. Later that evening, as the sun set and the cookout wound down, Hildegard stood at the edge of the field, looking out at the Bavarian countryside that looked so much like home, and yet was now so strange to her. Sergeant Chen appeared beside her, holding 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. He offered her one, and she took it, and they stood together in comfortable silence, drinking their drinks and watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. "Thank you," Hildegard said in English, one of the few phrases she knew. Sergeant Chen smiled at her. "You are welcome," he said, his pronunciation careful and clear so she would understand. It was such a small moment, a shared drink at the end of a long day. But Hildegard knew she would remember it for the rest of her life. This man, whose country had been at war with hers, whose face marked him as a target for the kind of hateful ideology she had been taught to accept, had spent an afternoon teaching her to cook American food, and had ended the day by bringing her a cold drink as a gesture of simple friendliness. There was no strategy in it, no manipulation. It was just kindness offered freely, and it meant more to her than she could express. The cookout became a turning point in the atmosphere at Camp 17. The women had worked alongside their captors, eaten with them, talked with them, even danced with them. And the experience had broken down barriers that lectures and classes could not reach. In the days that followed, the mood in the barracks shifted. There was less whispering, less suspicion, less clinging to old resentments. The women began to speak more openly about their changing perceptions, admitting to each other that perhaps they had been wrong about America and Americans, that perhaps the future did not have to be as bleak as they had feared. Hildegard became friends with Corporal Reeves, who visited the barracks sometimes in the evenings to practice her German and talk about books they were both reading from the camp library. She became friends with Sergeant Chen, who did not need to speak her language to communicate through smiles and gestures and small acts of consideration. She found that she looked forward to meals now, not just for the food, which was still extraordinary, but for the social experience of sitting with Americans and fellow Germans and sharing something more than just nourishment. The educational classes took on new meaning as well. Hildegard listened to Lieutenant Whitmore with genuine attention now, asking questions not to challenge him but to understand. She read the materials he assigned, books about American history and government and philosophy, and she thought about how the principles they described connected to the treatment she was receiving. The Americans were not being kind because they were naive or weak. They were being kind because they believed in something, some set of ideas about human dignity and the possibility of redemption that shaped how they acted even toward their enemies. The Hamburgers and Coca-Cola were expressions of those ideas, made tangible and consumable, offered 3 times a day as proof that the values were real. 6 weeks after arriving at Camp 17, Hildegard had a conversation with Major Reynolds that clarified much of what she had been experiencing. The Major called her into her office for what she described as a routine check-in, but the conversation quickly became something more substantial. Major Reynolds asked Hildegard how she was adjusting, what she thought of the camp, whether she had any concerns or suggestions. Hildegard answered carefully at first, then with increasing honesty as the Major's questions made clear that she genuinely wanted to know. "I do not understand why you treat us this way." Hildegard finally said, "We served your enemy. We contributed to the war against you. You could put us in cells and feed us bread and water and no one would object. Instead, you give us hamburgers and Coca-Cola and classes about democracy. I do not understand what you want from us." Major Reynolds was quiet for a moment, considering her response. Then she said something that Hildegard would never forget. "We want you to go home," she said. "Eventually, when everything is processed and resolved, you will go home to Germany. And when you get there, you will help rebuild your country. That is unavoidable. You are young and educated and capable, and Germany will need you. The question is what kind of country you will rebuild. Will it be a country that makes the same mistakes, that follows the same path that led to this catastrophe? Or will it be something different, something better, something that can be a peaceful neighbor and partner to the rest of the world? We cannot make that choice for you. Only Germans can make that choice, but we can show you that another way is possible. We can show you what a society looks like when it is built on different principles. And the best way to show you is not to tell you about it, but to let you live it, even if only for a little while, even if only in a prison camp. The food you eat, the way you are treated, the classes you attend, all of that is us showing you who we are and who we want to be. What you do with that knowledge is up to you." Hildegard left the Major's office in a state of profound contemplation. She had been looking for hidden motives, for strategic calculations, and perhaps those existed at some level. But Major Reynolds had described something simpler and more ambitious, an attempt to change minds and hearts through example, to plant seeds that might grow into something unforeseeable. It was either incredibly naive or incredibly wise, and Hildegard was not sure which. That night, lying in her bunk, she thought about her father. He had been a teacher for over 20 years before he was conscripted and sent to the Eastern Front, where he had been wounded and sent home in 1943, walking with a cane for the rest of his life. He had never talked much about his experiences in the military, but he had talked often about education, about its power to shape minds and build futures. He had believed that teaching was the most important work a person could do because it multiplied itself, each student carrying forward what they had learned and passing it on to others. Major Reynolds was a teacher too, Hildegard realized. This whole camp was a classroom, and the lessons were taught not through lectures alone, but through every meal, every interaction, every moment of unexpected kindness. The curriculum was American values, American plenty, American ways of treating people, and the students were German women who would soon go home and live the rest of their lives under the influence of what they had learned here. Would it work? Hildegard did not know. She knew that she was changing, that her old certainties were dissolving, that she was beginning to imagine possibilities she had never considered before. But she was one person, and Germany was a nation of millions who had not experienced what she was experiencing. Could a few thousand women who passed through camps like this one really make a difference to the future of their country? She thought about the Hamburgers and Coca-Cola. She thought about how those simple foods had affected her, how they had begun the process of breaking down her assumptions and opening her mind to new ideas. If food could do that, if the experience of being treated well could do that, then perhaps Major Reynolds was right. Perhaps example was more powerful than argument, kindness more persuasive than coercion. Perhaps the way to change a society was not to force it, but to feed it. Literally and metaphorically, to nourish it with evidence of what was possible until it grew in new directions on its own. Hildegard fell asleep that night, thinking about what she would do when she went home. She did not have answers yet, only questions, but they were different questions than she had been asking before. They were questions about building rather than destroying, creating rather than following, hoping rather than fearing, and that, she thought, might be exactly what Major Reynolds intended. The next morning, Hildegard went to breakfast with a new awareness. She took her tray and received her scrambled eggs and bacon and toast, her glass of orange juice and her cup of coffee, and she carried it to her table and sat down and began to eat. The food was delicious as always, prepared with care and served with respect, and she savored every bite. But now she tasted something more than flavors. She tasted intention. She tasted hope. She tasted, in some strange way, the future. Around her, 346 other women were eating the same breakfast, and Hildegard wondered how many of them were having similar thoughts. She caught Margaret's eye across the table, and her friend gave her a small nod, as if she understood what Hildegard was feeling without needing to be told. Perhaps the seeds were sprouting already in all of them, in ways they could not yet see, but would one day come to understand. The weeks continued to pass, and the camp continued its work of quiet transformation. There were more cookouts, more classes, more conversations between captives and captors that blurred the line between the two categories. There were moments of tension and resistance, women who could not or would not accept what was being offered. But there were more moments of connection, understanding, even friendship. And always there was food, abundant and varied and given freely, a constant reminder that the world was larger and more generous than they had been led to believe. Hildegard counted the days and waited for news about when she might be released. She was eager to go home, to see her father, to begin whatever new life awaited her. But she was also aware that she would miss Camp 17 when she left it, miss the routine and the safety, and the strange fellowship of this place between war and peace. She would miss the hamburgers, she admitted to herself. She would miss the Coca-Cola. She would miss sitting with Sergeant Chen and Corporal Reeves and eating together like friends rather than enemies. And she would miss most of all the sense of possibility that the camp had given her, the sense that the future was not fixed, that people could change and nations could change, that what seemed impossible might be achieved through patience and persistence and simple acts of humanity repeated over and over until they became the norm rather than the exception. That sense of possibility was the most valuable thing the Americans had given her, more valuable than all the food and all the comforts. It was, she thought, the real point of everything, not to make them comfortable but to make them hopeful, not to indoctrinate them but to inspire them, not to turn them into Americans but to show them that they could be better Germans, the kind of Germans who built things instead of destroying them, who created abundance instead of scarcity, who treated strangers with kindness instead of suspicion. Hildegard did not know if she was strong enough to live up to that possibility. She did not know if any of them were, but she knew that she wanted to try, and that wanting was already a kind of beginning. The spring turned towards summer, and the apple blossoms that Hildegard had noticed on the day of her arrival became small green fruits growing on the trees outside the camp. Life was continuing, as it always did, regardless of wars and captivities and all the things that humans did to each other. And in Camp 17, 347 German women continued to eat American food and attend American classes and interact with American personnel, absorbing experiences that would stay with them for the rest of their lives and shape them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Hildegard thought about what she would tell her father when she saw him again. She thought about how she would describe the Hamburgers and Coca-Cola, the educational classes and the cookouts, Major Reynolds and Sergeant Chen and Corporal Reeves. She thought about how she would explain the transformation that was happening inside her, the old beliefs crumbling and new ones taking their place, the fear giving way to hope and the resentment giving way to gratitude. She did not have the words yet, but she would find them. And when she did, she would become a teacher too, like her father, like Major Reynolds, passing on what she had learned to anyone who would listen. That was how change happened, she understood now. Not through force or coercion, but through sharing and example, one person at a time, one meal at a time, one act of kindness at a time. The future was coming, and Hildegard was ready to meet it with a full stomach and an open mind. That was the gift the Americans had given her, wrapped in hamburger buns and served in bottles of sweet brown liquid. It was not what she had expected when she climbed down from that truck on the morning of April 23rd, terrified and certain of her doom. But it was, she thought, exactly what she needed. And so she waited and she ate and she learned and she changed, and she began slowly and tentatively to imagine what she might do with the rest of her life. The story of those women, and of Camp 17, and of Hamburgers and Coca-Cola as instruments of transformation, was only beginning. What happened next would test everything they had learned and everything they hoped to become. The summer of 1945 brought changes to Camp 17 that none of the women had anticipated. As June arrived with warm winds and long evenings, Major Reynolds announced that the camp would begin a new program designed to prepare the women for their eventual return to civilian life. The program would include vocational training, additional language instruction, and something she called community integration exercises, which would involve supervised visits to nearby German towns to help with reconstruction efforts. Hildegard received this news with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The thought of leaving the camp, even temporarily, felt both liberating and frightening. Camp 17 had become familiar, safe in its routines and expectations. The outside world was unknown territory now, a Germany she no longer recognized, struggling under occupation and ruin. But she also understood that she could not stay here forever, that the camp was meant to be a transition rather than a destination, and that eventually she would have to face whatever awaited her beyond the fence. The vocational training began the following week. The Americans had brought in instructors to teach skills they believed would be useful in post-war Germany: typing and stenography, bookkeeping and accounting, basic medical care and hygiene, and English language proficiency. The women were allowed to choose which courses they wanted to take, based on their interests and previous experience. Hildegard chose typing and English, thinking that these skills would give her the most options when she returned to civilian life. The typing class was taught by a civilian woman named Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a 53-year-old former secretary from Boston who had volunteered for overseas service after her husband passed away. Mrs. Patterson was patient and methodical, starting with the basics of finger placement and gradually building speed and accuracy through daily practice. She had brought with her 15 typewriters, heavy black machines that clattered loudly when the keys were struck, and the sound of 30 hands typing exercises became a familiar background noise in the camp. Hildegard discovered that she had an aptitude for typing. Her fingers were nimble from her work with communications equipment, and she quickly learned to find the keys without looking, her eyes on the text she was copying, while her hands moved automatically below. Within 3 weeks, she was typing 40 words per minute with few errors, and Mrs. Patterson praised her progress and encouraged her to aim for 60 words per minute by the end of the summer. The English classes were more challenging but equally rewarding. Hildegard had studied English in school before the war, but her knowledge was limited and rusty from years of disuse. The instructor, a young lieutenant named Thomas Brennan, who had studied linguistics at Yale University before joining the army, started with basic vocabulary and grammar and advanced quickly as the women proved eager to learn. He used American magazines and newspapers as teaching materials, having the women read articles aloud and discuss their content, and Hildegard found that she was learning not just language but culture, absorbing American attitudes and assumptions through the words she studied. Lieutenant Brennan also taught them American slang and idioms, the informal expressions that native speakers used in everyday conversation. He explained what it meant to be in hot water, or to have a chip on your shoulder, or to cost an arm and a leg. He taught them to say okay and sure thing and you bet, and he laughed kindly when their pronunciation came out, stilted and overly formal. He told them that language was alive, always changing and growing, and that the best way to learn it was to use it without fear of making mistakes. Hildegard practiced her English whenever she could, with the American personnel who were willing to converse with her, with fellow students who wanted to improve together, even alone in her bunk at night, whispering vocabulary words and conjugating verbs until she fell asleep. She found that the language opened doors, allowing her to communicate more directly with people like Sergeant Chen and Corporal Reeves, understanding their jokes and references and cultural assumptions without needing translation. Each conversation made her feel more connected to these people who had been her enemies and were becoming something else, something she did not have a word for yet. The community integration exercises began in late June. Groups of 20 women at a time were transported by truck to nearby towns where they worked alongside German civilians and American soldiers on reconstruction projects. The work was physical and demanding, clearing rubble from damaged buildings, sorting bricks and timber for reuse, helping to repair roads and bridges that had been damaged during the final weeks of the conflict. But it was also deeply meaningful, a chance to contribute to the rebuilding of their own country and to interact with Germans who had not experienced what they had experienced. Hildegard's first trip was to the town of Friedberg itself, a small community about 10 kilometers from the camp that had suffered moderate damage from aerial attacks in the final months of the war. She worked with a crew clearing debris from what had been a school, carrying broken bricks in buckets and loading them onto a cart to be hauled away. The physical labor was exhausting in the summer heat, and by midday her arms and back ached and her uniform was soaked with sweat. But there was satisfaction in seeing the pile of rubble shrink, in knowing that this building might one day be a school again, where children would learn and grow. During a break for lunch, the American soldiers distributed food to everyone working at the site, German civilians and prisoners alike. There were sandwiches made with thick slices of ham and cheese, apples and oranges, cookies wrapped in wax paper, and bottles of Coca-Cola kept cold in insulated containers. Hildegard sat on a broken wall eating her sandwich and watching the scene around her, Americans and Germans sharing a meal in the ruins of a school, working together toward a common purpose. A year ago, such a scene would have been unimaginable. Now it was simply Tuesday. An elderly German man sat down beside her, introducing himself as Herr Wilhelm Dressner. He had been a teacher at this school for 31 years before it was damaged, and he hoped to return to teaching when it was rebuilt. He asked Hildegard about herself, where she was from, how she had come to be working here, and she told him an abbreviated version of her story, the communications service, the capture, Camp 17. He listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, and when she finished he said something that surprised her. "You are fortunate," he said. "The Americans are treating you well. That is not what we expected. That is not what we were told to expect." Hildegard agreed that she was fortunate. She told him about the food at the camp, the hamburgers and Coca-Cola, the abundant meals 3 times a day. She told him about the educational classes and the vocational training, the library and the recreation yard, the medical care and the mail service. Herr Dressner listened with widening eyes, and she realized that he had assumed she was being treated as a prisoner in the harshest sense, deprived and punished and degraded. "Why?" he asked. "Why do they treat you this way?" Hildegard thought about Major Reynolds and the conversation in her office. She thought about Lieutenant Whitmore and his classes on democracy. She thought about Sergeant Chen and the cookout and the bottle of Coca-Cola they had shared while watching the sunset. "I think they want us to learn," she said. "They want us to see another way of doing things. They think if they treat us well, we will treat others well when we go home. They think kindness is contagious." Herr Dressner considered this for a long moment. "That is either very foolish or very wise," he said finally. Hildegard smiled. "I have thought the same thing many times." They finished their lunch and returned to work, but the conversation stayed with Hildegard. She had articulated something she had been feeling for weeks without quite being able to express it. Kindness is contagious. It was a simple idea, almost childishly simple, and yet it seemed to capture the essence of what the Americans were trying to do. They were not just feeding and educating their prisoners, they were infecting them with a different way of being in the world, hoping that the infection would spread when the prisoners returned to their communities. The integration exercises continued throughout July, and Hildegard went on 6 more trips to various towns and villages in the area. She cleared rubble and repaired roads, and helped to rebuild a small bridge that had been destroyed by retreating forces. She met dozens of German civilians, some friendly and some suspicious, some grateful for the help, and some resentful of the circumstances that made it necessary. She answered their questions about the camp as honestly as she could, trying to convey the strange experience of being a well-treated prisoner, and she saw the same mixture of surprise and confusion that Herr Dresner had shown. She also saw the devastation of her country, the bombed buildings and displaced families, the food shortages and the uncertainty about the future. The contrast with Camp 17 was stark and troubling. Inside the camp, she ate hamburgers and Coca-Cola and attended classes on democracy. Outside the camp, her compatriots struggled to find enough bread and potatoes to survive. The inequality felt wrong, even though she had done nothing to cause it and could do nothing to change it. She began to understand why the Americans wanted to send them home as soon as possible. Their relative comfort was an anomaly that could not be sustained, a temporary bubble that would eventually have to pop. In early August, news came that changed the mood of the entire camp. The war in the Pacific had ended, following the deployment of a new type of weapon against 2 Japanese cities. The details were vague at first, filtered through official announcements and rumors, but gradually a picture emerged of destruction on a scale that surpassed anything that had come before. Entire cities had been leveled in instants, hundreds of thousands of people affected by single devices that harnessed the power of the atom itself. The world, it seemed, had entered a new age, and no one knew quite what that meant. Major Reynolds addressed the women in a special assembly, explaining what had happened as best she could, and acknowledging the uncertainty that everyone felt. She told them that the end of the war in the Pacific would accelerate the process of returning them to their homes, that the American military would now be focused on demobilization and occupation rather than active conflict, and that they should begin preparing themselves mentally and practically for reintegration into German society. She told them that the skills they had learned and the perspectives they had gained would be valuable in the years ahead, and that she hoped they would use their experiences to contribute positively to their country's future. Hildegard listened to the Major's words with a strange mixture of emotions. She wanted to go home, had wanted it since the moment she arrived, and yet the prospect now filled her with anxiety as well as anticipation. The camp had become a cocoon, a protected space where she could learn and grow and change without facing the consequences of that change. Going home meant testing her new beliefs against the reality of a devastated country, a grieving population, a future that no one could predict. Going home meant finding out whether she was really different or whether she would simply revert to what she had been before. The days that followed were filled with preparation and farewell. The women who were scheduled to leave first, those whose homes were in areas already stable enough to receive them, packed their few belongings and said goodbye to friends they had made over the past months. Hildegard was not in the first group, her home city of Hamburg being in the British zone of occupation and requiring additional coordination, but she helped others prepare and tried to absorb their mixture of excitement and fear. She spent her remaining time at Camp 17 with increased intensity, attending every class and practicing her typing and English with renewed dedication. She wanted to extract every bit of value from the experience before it ended, to make sure she left with everything she could possibly carry away. She had long conversations with Lieutenant Whitmore about democracy and governance, asking questions she had never thought to ask, and receiving answers that challenged her in ways she had not anticipated. She practiced her English with Corporal Reeves until she could hold a conversation for an hour without major difficulty. She even learned to make hamburgers herself, working in the kitchen with Sergeant Chen and the other cooks, mastering the technique of forming patties and seasoning them and cooking them to the right degree of doneness. One evening in late August, Hildegard sat with Margaret in the recreation yard, watching the sun set over the Bavarian hills and talking about the future. Margaret had been assigned to a group leaving the following week, returning to her family in a small town near Nuremberg, and the two friends knew they might never see each other again. "What will you do when you get home?" Hildegard asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering. "I will find my family," she said. "I will help them however I can, and I will try to remember what I learned here. I will try to be the kind of person who treats others well, even when it is not easy, even when they do not deserve it." Hildegard nodded. "That is a good plan. What about you?" Hildegard had been thinking about this question for weeks, turning it over in her mind late at night, considering possibilities and discarding them. "I think I want to teach," she said finally. "Like my father, like Major Reynolds. I want to share what I have learned with others who did not have the chance to learn it." Margaret smiled. "You will be good at that. You have always been good at explaining things. I hope so. I'm afraid, though, afraid that no one will want to hear what I have to say. Afraid that they will think I have been corrupted or brainwashed by the Americans. Afraid that the old ways are too strong to change." Margaret reached over and took her hand. "The old ways led us to this," she said. "A war we lost, a country in ruins, families destroyed, millions gone forever. Anyone who wants to go back to that is a fool. You will find people who want something different. You will find people who are ready to listen." Hildegard squeezed her friend's hand, grateful for the reassurance, even if she was not entirely convinced by it. They sat together in silence as the sky darkened, watching the first stars appear and thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. Margareta left Camp 17 on September 2nd, 1945. Hildegard was there to see her off, standing with a group of friends as the truck pulled away, and Margaret waved from the back until she disappeared from view. The camp felt emptier after that, the barracks less crowded and the mess hall less noisy, and Hildegard realized that this process would continue. More departures and more goodbyes, until eventually she too would climb into a truck and leave this place forever. Her own departure came 3 weeks later, on September 23rd, almost exactly 5 months after her arrival. She had received word that transportation had been arranged to Hamburg, a journey that would take several days given the state of the roads and railways, and that she would be released upon arrival to make her own way to her family home. She packed her belongings the night before, the civilian clothes she had been given and the few personal items she had accumulated, a book from the library that Mrs. Patterson had given her as a gift, a photograph of her typing class, a handwritten letter of recommendation from Major Reynolds that she hoped might help her find employment. On the morning of her departure, Hildegard made a final round of farewells. She thanked Lieutenant Whitmore for his classes and told him that she would never forget what he had taught her. She thanked Mrs. Patterson for her patience and her gift, promising to continue improving her typing speed. She found Corporal Reeves in the administrative building and embraced her, speaking in English to say that she hoped they would meet again someday. She looked for Sergeant Chen, but could not find him, and she felt a pang of disappointment that she would not be able to say goodbye to someone who had been so kind to her without ever sharing a common language. Finally, she went to Major Reynolds' office. The Major was waiting for her, standing beside her desk with an expression that was warm but also serious. "Brenner," she said, "I wanted to speak with you before you left." "Yes, Major." Major Reynolds gestured to a chair, and Hildegard sat down. The Major remained standing, looking out the window at the camp that she had built and commanded for over a year. "You have been a model prisoner," she said. "You have participated fully in all programs. You have caused no disciplinary problems, and you have shown genuine engagement with the educational opportunities we provided. I want you to know that your progress has been noted and appreciated. Thank you, Major." Hildegard felt a warmth in her chest at the praise. "I have tried to make the most of my time here." Major Reynolds turned to face her. "The experience you have had here is unusual," she said. "Most prisoners do not receive this kind of treatment. Most people do not have the opportunity to see their former enemies up close, to share meals with them, and learn from them and discover that they are human beings rather than monsters. You have had that opportunity. You have a responsibility to use it well." Hildegard nodded. "I understand. I intend to." The Major studied her for a moment, as if assessing her sincerity. Then she smiled slightly. "I believe you do. I have watched you change over these months, Brenner. I have seen you go from frightened and suspicious to open and curious. I have seen you ask questions that challenge your assumptions and listen to answers that contradict what you were taught. That kind of change is not easy. It requires courage and honesty and a willingness to admit that you were wrong. You have shown all of those qualities." Hildegard did not know what to say. She felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back, not wanting to appear weak. Major Reynolds reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small object, which she handed to Hildegard. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola, cold from the refrigerator, its glass surface beaded with condensation. "I wanted you to have this." The Major said, "Consider it a reminder of what you experienced here and what it meant. Whenever you are tempted to fall back into old patterns of thinking, whenever you are tempted to hate or fear or despair, look at this and remember. Remember that kindness is possible. Remember that abundance is possible. Remember that former enemies can become friends and that the future does not have to repeat the past." Hildegard took the bottle, cradling it in her hands like something precious. "I will remember," she said. "I promise." "Good." Major Reynolds extended her hand, and Hildegard stood and shook it. "Good luck, Brenner. I hope you find what you're looking for." Hildegard left the office and walked to the truck that would take her away from Camp 17. She climbed into the back, finding a seat among 7 other women who were also leaving that day, and settled her pack between her feet. The bottle of Coca-Cola she kept in her hands, not wanting to put it down, feeling its cold weight as a tangible connection to everything she was leaving behind. The truck engine started and they began to move. Hildegard watched through the open back as the camp receded, the barracks and the mess hall and the administration building growing smaller until they disappeared around a curve in the road. She took a deep breath and turned to face forward, toward Hamburg and her father and whatever came next. The journey took 4 days, passing through countryside that showed the scars of the recent conflict and cities that were barely recognizable under the damage they had suffered. Hildegard saw things that horrified her, collapsed buildings and displaced families, and a pervasive sense of defeat that hung over everything. But she also saw things that gave her hope, people working together to clear debris and rebuild, children playing in the rubble, as if determined to find joy despite everything. Small acts of kindness between strangers that suggested the human spirit was not entirely crushed. She arrived in Hamburg on September 27th and made her way through the damaged streets to the neighborhood where she had grown up. The city was barely recognizable, whole blocks reduced to ruins. Landmarks she had known her entire life simply gone. But her family's apartment building was still standing, damaged but intact, and she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor with her heart pounding and her hands trembling. Her father opened the door. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair grayer and his face more lined, and he leaned heavily on his cane. But his eyes were the same, kind and intelligent, and now filling with tears as he recognized his daughter standing before him. "Hildegard," he said, and his voice broke on her name. She fell into his arms and wept, all the fear and uncertainty and hope of the past 5 months pouring out of her. He held her tightly, his own tears falling into her hair, and they stood there in the doorway for a long time without speaking. Father and daughter reunited after so many months of not knowing whether they would ever see each other again. Later, after she had washed and changed and eaten a small meal of bread and cheese that was all her father had to offer, they sat together in the cramped living room and talked. She told him about Camp 17, about the Hamburgers and Coca-Cola and the classes on democracy, about Major Reynolds and Sergeant Chen and Corporal Reeves. She told him about the cookout and the typing lessons and the community integration exercises. She told him how her thinking had changed, how she had begun to question everything she had believed before, how she was trying to imagine a different kind of future for herself and her country. Her father listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally and asking clarifying questions when he needed them. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, considering everything she had said. Then he spoke, and his words stayed with her for the rest of her life. "When I was a young teacher," he said, I believed that education was about filling empty vessels. I thought my job was to pour knowledge into my students' heads and hope that enough of it would stay. But I was wrong. That is not what education is. Education is about lighting fires. It is about giving people the spark they need to illuminate their own minds and find their own paths. What you have described this camp and these Americans and these experiences, that is what they did for you. They gave you the spark. Now you must tend the fire and let it grow and share its light with others. Hildegard thought about those words constantly in the months and years that followed. She found work as a typist and translator for one of the occupying authorities, using the skills she had learned at Camp 17 to earn money and support herself and her father. She continued to study English until she was fluent, reading American books and magazines, and listening to American radio programs to improve her comprehension. She joined a discussion group organized by a local civic organization, a gathering of Germans and Americans and British who met weekly to talk about democracy and governance and the future of Europe, and she found that she had much to contribute to those conversations. In 1948, she enrolled in a program to become a teacher. It was what she had wanted since her conversation with Margaret in the recreation yard, but she had needed time to prepare herself, to develop her knowledge and her confidence to believe that she truly had something worth teaching. The program was rigorous and demanding, requiring 2 years of study and practical training, but she applied herself with the same dedication she had brought to her typing and English lessons and graduated near the top of her class. She began teaching in 1950 at a secondary school in Hamburg, where she instructed students in English language and what was called social studies, which included civics, history, and geography. She was nervous at first, uncertain whether she could connect with young people who had not experienced what she had experienced and who might be resistant to the ideas she wanted to share. But she discovered that she had a gift for the work, a talent for explaining complex concepts in ways that students could understand, and for creating an atmosphere in her classroom where questions were welcomed and debate was encouraged. She taught her students about democracy and human rights, about the importance of critical thinking and the dangers of propaganda. She taught them about America and its history and values, not as a perfect society, but as an example of what could be achieved when people committed themselves to certain principles and ideals. She taught them that former enemies could become partners and that the future was not determined by the past. And sometimes, when the moment was right and the students seemed ready to hear it, she told them about Camp 17 and the Hamburgers and Coca-Cola, and how those simple things had changed her life. She kept the bottle of Coca-Cola that Major Reynolds had given her. She never opened it, never drank its contents, but she kept it on a shelf in her apartment where she could see it every day. It was a reminder, just as the Major had intended, of kindness and abundance and possibility. Whenever she was discouraged, whenever she doubted whether her work was making any difference, she looked at that bottle and remembered what it represented. She remembered that change was possible, that people could learn and grow, that the future could be different from the past if enough people wanted it to be and were willing to work for it. In 1952, she received a letter from Margarete. Her old friend had married a local businessman and had 2 children and was living a quiet life in her small town near Nuremberg. She wrote that she often thought about Camp 17 and the things they had learned there, and that she tried to pass those lessons on to her children. She wrote that she hoped Hildegard was well, and that she had found what she was looking for. She enclosed a photograph of her family, smiling in front of their small house, and Hildegard put it on her shelf next to the Coca-Cola bottle. In 1955, on the 10th anniversary of her arrival at Camp 17, Hildegard wrote a letter to Major Catherine Reynolds. She did not know if the address she had would still reach her, but she wanted to try. She told the Major about her life since leaving the camp, about her work as a teacher, and her efforts to share what she had learned. She told her that she had kept the bottle of Coca-Cola and that she looked at it every day. She told her that she had never forgotten the conversation in her office, the one about showing people another way of doing things and hoping they would carry it forward. She told her that she had tried to do that, to be a teacher in the way the Major had been a teacher, and that she hoped she was making a difference. 6 weeks later, she received a response. Major Reynolds had retired from the army and was living in Portland, Oregon, where she volunteered with refugee resettlement organizations. She wrote that she remembered Hildegard well, and that she was moved to hear about her work as a teacher. She wrote that the Camp 17 program had been controversial within the military, criticized by some as too soft and by others as a waste of resources, but that she had always believed it was the right approach, and that letters like Hildegard's confirmed that belief. She wrote that she was proud of what Hildegard had become, and that she hoped they would meet again someday. They never did meet again, but they continued to correspond for years, exchanging letters 2 or 3 times annually, sharing news of their lives and their thoughts on the changing world. Major Reynolds sent Hildegard American books and magazines that she thought would interest her. Hildegard sent photographs of her students and descriptions of their discussions and debates. The correspondence became one of the most important relationships in Hildegard's life, a connection across the ocean to the woman who had given her the spark that changed everything. Hildegard taught for 33 years, retiring in 1983 at the age of 61. By then, she had instructed thousands of students, many of whom went on to become teachers themselves, passing forward the lessons they had learned in her classroom. She had seen Germany transform from a defeated and occupied nation to a prosperous democracy, a partner to the countries that had once been its enemies, and a leader in the project of European unity. She had seen the wall go up that divided Berlin and would live to see it come down. She had seen things she never could have imagined when she climbed down from that truck on an April morning in 1945, certain that she was going to a labor camp or worse. On the day of her retirement, her students gave her a party. They decorated her classroom with streamers and brought food and gifts, and they made speeches about what she had meant to them and what they had learned from her. At the end of the celebration, one of her students, a young woman named Anna, who reminded Hildegard of herself at that age, presented her with a special gift that the class had pooled their money to buy. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola. Hildegard laughed and cried at the same time, holding the bottle up for everyone to see. She told them the story then, the story she had told many times before, but that never failed to move her. She told them about Camp 17 and Major Reynolds and the Hamburgers and Coca-Cola that had opened her eyes to a different way of seeing the world. She told them about coming home and becoming a teacher and trying to pass forward what she had received. She told them that they were part of that chain now, that what they had learned from her they would teach to others, and that in this way the spark would continue to spread and the light would continue to grow. Anna asked her what happened to the original bottle, the one Major Reynolds had given her. Hildegard said it was still on the shelf in her apartment, unopened after all these years. Anna asked why she had never drunk it, and Hildegard thought for a moment before answering. "Because it is not really a drink," she said. "It is a symbol. It represents something that cannot be consumed or used up. As long as that bottle stays sealed, the possibility it represents stays alive. If I opened it and drank it, it would be gone, but sealed, it lasts forever. It reminds me every day that kindness matters, that abundance is possible, that enemies can become friends. Those are not things I want to finish. Those are things I want to keep going." She took the new bottle home and put it on the shelf next to the old one. 2 bottles of Coca-Cola, 40 years apart, representing the same message. She looked at them every morning when she woke up and every evening before she went to bed, and she thought about the journey they represented. From that frightened young woman on a truck in Bavaria to this retired teacher in a reunified Germany, a life shaped by hamburgers and Coca-Cola and the unexpected kindness of former enemies. Hildegard Brenner lived until 2007, passing away peacefully at the age of 85. She was survived by no children of her own, but by generations of students who carried her lessons with them into their own lives and work. At her funeral, Anna, now a teacher herself, spoke about what Hildegard had meant to her and to so many others. She talked about the 2 bottles of Coca-Cola that still sat on the shelf in Hildegard's apartment, symbols of a transformation that had begun in a prison camp 62 years earlier and had rippled outward through countless lives. The bottles were donated to a local museum, where they became part of an exhibit on German Reconstruction and the role of American occupation policies in shaping post-war society. The exhibit told the story of Camp 17 and women like Hildegard, how they had arrived expecting punishment and received education, how they had tasted hamburgers and Coca-Cola and discovered that their enemies were human beings, how they had returned to their communities and helped to build a different kind of country than the one that had led them to war. Visitors to the exhibit often stood for a long time in front of those two bottles, reading the plaques that explained their significance. Some of them were old enough to remember the war and its aftermath, and they nodded with recognition at the details of the story. Others were young, born decades after the events described, and they struggled to understand how simple things like food and drink could have such profound effects. But all of them, old and young, came away with something to think about, some new understanding of how change happens and what makes it possible. Major Catherine Reynolds never saw the exhibit. She passed away in 1992, at the age of 88, in the same city where she had been born. But she knew before she died that her work had mattered, that the approach she had developed and defended had made a real difference in real lives. She knew because Hildegard had told her in letter after letter over nearly 40 years, and because she had received similar letters from other women who had passed through Camp 17 and gone on to contribute to their country in positive ways. The camp itself was dismantled in late 1945, its buildings repurposed and eventually demolished, its location returning to farmland that showed no trace of what had been there. But the camp lived on in the memories of those who had experienced it, and in the stories they told and the lessons they taught. It lived on in the children and students of those women, who learned from them that kindness mattered, and that people could change, and that the future did not have to repeat the past. And it lived on in the simple image of hamburgers and Coca-Cola served to prisoners who expected bread and water. That image became a symbol, a shorthand for everything the Americans had tried to do and everything it had meant to those who experienced it. It was a symbol of abundance in the midst of scarcity, of generosity in the midst of conflict, of hope in the midst of despair. It was a symbol that transcended language and culture and time, communicating something essential about human possibility that could not be expressed any other way. Hildegard understood this at the end of her life, looking at those two bottles on her shelf. She understood that the hamburgers and Coca-Cola were never really about food and drink. They were about demonstrating a different way of being in the world, a way characterized by generosity rather than scarcity, by kindness rather than cruelty, by faith in human potential rather than cynicism about human nature. They were about showing rather than telling, acting rather than arguing, living the values you wanted others to adopt rather than just proclaiming them. That was the lesson of Camp 17. That was what Major Reynolds had understood, and what Hildegard had learned, and what she had tried to pass on to her students for 33 years. Change happens not through force or coercion, but through example and experience. Hearts and minds are won not through propaganda, but through hamburgers and Coca-Cola, through the accumulation of small kindnesses that add up to something larger than themselves. It was a lesson that Hildegard carried with her until the day she died. It was a lesson that her students carried forward into their own lives and passed on to others. It was a lesson that spread outward like ripples in a pond, touching lives that would never know where it came from, but would be shaped by it nonetheless. And it all began with a convoy of trucks on an April morning, carrying frightened women toward an unknown fate, and the smell of hamburgers cooking in a mess hall, and a bottle of sweet brown liquid that tasted like nothing they had ever experienced.